Nestled in the heart of a picturesque suburban neighborhood, surrounded by tree-lined streets and charming homes, lived a dedicated farmer named Ethan Carter. Unlike his neighbors, who spent their weekends tending to flower beds or relaxing on porches, Ethan devoted every spare moment to his small but flourishing backyard farm. Rows of vibrant vegetables, lush fruit trees, and fragrant herbs transformed his land into a haven of freshness. At the edge of his driveway stood a modest yet inviting farm stand, where he sold his homegrown produce to neighbors. For years, families stopped by to chat, pick out the ripest tomatoes, or grab a handful of crisp cucumbers. It wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a hub of connection, a spot where community bonds were nurtured. But just as Ethan's passion for farming was reaching new heights, a storm was brewing. One morning, a cold and impersonal letter arrived from the Homeowners Association, HOA, a formal notice, a demand, a ban. Ethan's farm stand was deemed a violation of HOA regulations, and he was ordered to shut it down immediately. Little did they know, Ethan wasn't the type to back down without a fight. Ethan Carter sat at his kitchen table, the HOA notice crumpled in his fist. His heart pounded with frustration as he reread the cold, bureaucratic language. Unauthorized commercial activity, violation of community guidelines, cease operations immediately. The words stung like a slap to the face. He had spent years cultivating his small farm, pouring his heart and soul into every leafy green, every juicy peach. His farm stand wasn't just about selling produce. It was about sharing. It was about giving families access to fresh, organic food, helping kids learn where their meals came from, and fostering a sense of unity in the neighborhood. And now, the HOA wanted to erase all of that? Ethan refused to believe his neighbors truly supported this. Every day, he saw the joy on their faces as they picked out the freshest tomatoes or exchanged recipes over baskets of zucchini. His farm stand was more than just a place to buy food. It was a cornerstone of the community. Determined not to give up without a fight, Ethan took action. That evening, he crafted a carefully worded email to the HOA board members, pleading his case. He explained how his stand wasn't a business. It was a service, a way to enrich the neighborhood, not disrupt it. He asked for a meeting, hopeful that a reasonable compromise could be reached. Days passed. No response. Frustrated but not defeated, Ethan turned to his neighbors. He knocked on doors, spoke to families who had relied on his produce for years, and explained what was happening. The reaction was immediate and passionate. "This is ridiculous," one mother scoffed, shaking her head. "Where else am I supposed to find organic produce this fresh?" "I don't get it," an elderly man added. "You're not running a supermarket, Ethan. You're just selling a few vegetables." The community rallied behind him. Letters of support poured into the HOA's inbox. Neighbors began posting about the issue on social media, calling for action. Within days, the peaceful suburban streets buzzed with outrage. But the HOA stood firm. Their response was clear. Rules are rules. No exceptions. Ethan felt his frustration boiling over. He had tried diplomacy. He had tried reasoning. But if they wanted to play hardball, fine. A new idea began to take shape. One that would make everyone feel the consequences of the HOA's decision. His farm didn't just supply his stand. It also provided fresh produce for the local grocery store he owned. What if he simply stopped supplying it? If the HOA wanted to cut off the neighborhood's access to fresh, local food, he would show them exactly what that meant. No more ripe strawberries, no more crisp bell peppers, no more farm-fresh eggs. If they wanted to take away his farm stand, He would take away their food supply. The next morning, Ethan Carter made a bold decision. He walked into his grocery store, the very place that had always been stocked with produce from his farm, and gave his employees a simple order: pull all the farm-fresh stock from the shelves. His workers hesitated. "Are you sure?" one of them asked, eyeing the shelves lined with fresh greens, bright red tomatoes, and juicy peaches. Ethan nodded firmly. "I'm sure." Within hours, the once vibrant produce section looked empty. Shelves that had been filled with crisp lettuce and fragrant herbs were now bare. Customers walked in expecting their usual fresh selections, only to find nothing. Confusion quickly turned into frustration. "Where are the strawberries?" a woman asked, scanning the empty crates. "I came here for fresh tomatoes," an older man grumbled. "What's going on?" Ethan calmly explained to every confused shopper what had happened. "The HOA shut down my farm stand. They don't want local food here? Fine. Now no one gets it." Word spread like wildfire. The grocery store's regular customers, many of whom were also Ethan's farm stand patrons, felt the impact immediately. They were forced to drive miles to the nearest supermarket, where produce was more expensive and far less fresh. Parents who once bought their kids fresh fruit for school lunches found themselves stuck with low-quality alternatives. Elderly residents, who relied on Ethan's store for its accessibility, were left scrambling for options. And people were angry. Within days, the town was buzzing. Social media exploded with posts calling out the HOA's decision. "Why are they punishing a local farmer for helping his own community?" one person wrote. Another commented, "This is what happens when you let bureaucracy get in the way of common sense." The outrage snowballed into action. At the next HOA meeting, Ethan wasn't the only one speaking up. The entire community showed up, demanding answers. One by one, neighbors took turns voicing their frustrations. "My family depends on that produce," a mother said, her voice shaking with anger. "You took away our access to healthy food over a technicality." "This is about more than just vegetables," an elderly woman added. "This is about our right to support local farmers and businesses." Even HOA members, who had initially dismissed Ethan's concerns, now looked uneasy as the backlash grew stronger. Ethan remained calm, but his voice carried conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about our entire community. We should have the right to choose where our food comes from." The pressure was mounting. The community wasn't just asking for change anymore. They were demanding it. And the HOA? They were running out of excuses. The HOA board had expected some complaints, but nothing like this. They sat stiffly at the front of the meeting hall, facing a packed room of angry residents. This wasn't just a handful of people grumbling about a rule. This was a full-blown rebellion. Ethan stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, watching as one neighbor after another tore into the HOA's decision. "This is what happens when you enforce rules without thinking about the impact," a man in the crowd shouted. "We used to have access to fresh local food, and now we don't," another neighbor added. "Tell me, how is that an improvement?" The board members exchanged nervous glances. They had underestimated the community's response. What they thought was just a minor policy enforcement had turned into a neighborhood uprising. Ethan knew this was the moment to press harder. He stepped forward, his voice steady, his words sharp. "I started my farm stand to help people," he said, scanning the crowd. "I never asked for much, just the chance to share my harvest. But because of one rule, the entire community is suffering." He turned to the HOA members. "Tell me, who benefits from this ban?" Because it's not the families who relied on my produce. It's not the elderly residents who now struggle to find fresh food. And it's definitely not our local economy. Silence. The board members had no good answer. One of them, a woman named Linda Hawthorne, who had originally been one of the strongest enforcers of the ban, shifted uncomfortably. She cleared her throat. Mr. Carter, we understand that this has caused an inconvenience, but the rules are in place for a reason. We can't allow businesses to operate out of homes. Inconvenience, a woman in the audience scoffed. This isn't an inconvenience, it's a disaster. My kids haven't had fresh fruit in weeks because of this nonsense. The murmurs of agreement grew louder. Another board member, Daniel Reeves, rubbed his temples and sighed. Look, maybe we need to take another look at the rules. Linda shot him a sharp look. Daniel. No, Linda, he interrupted. This isn't just about bylaws anymore. It's about the people we serve. And right now, we're failing them. A wave of hope rippled through the crowd. For the first time, someone on the board was listening. Ethan saw his opening. I'm willing to work with you, he said. But this zero-tolerance policy? It's hurting the very people you're supposed to protect. We need to find a solution, together. Linda looked around the room, seeing the anger, the desperation, the unity. She exhaled. Let's revisit the rules. The room erupted in cheers. The battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Ethan knew they were winning. For the first time since the fight began, Ethan felt a shift in the air. The HOA was finally willing to listen. But that didn't mean victory was guaranteed. A week after the explosive meeting, Ethan received an email from Daniel Reeves, the board member who had spoken up in his favor. The subject line was simple. Let's talk. The following evening, Ethan walked into the HOA's office, his shoulders squared with determination. He wasn't just here to argue, he was here to negotiate. Seated across from him were Linda Hawthorne, Daniel Reeves, and two other board members. Linda still wore her usual expression of authority, but something was different this time. She wasn't dismissive. She was listening. Daniel leaned forward. Ethan, we've gone through the bylaws again. The rule about commercial activity was written to prevent disruptive businesses, large-scale operations, heavy foot traffic, noise complaints. But your farm stand? It doesn't fit that category. Ethan nodded. That's what I've been saying all along. Linda sighed. Look, I still have concerns. We can't just allow unrestricted home businesses. It sets a precedent. But, I'll admit, we may have been too rigid. For the first time since this all began, Ethan saw a real chance for change. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. I've drafted a proposal, a way for us to find common ground. His plan was simple yet powerful. Checkmark limited sales. Ethan would operate his farm stand only on weekends to minimize traffic concerns. Community benefits. A portion of his produce would be donated to local food banks and schools. Aesthetic standards. The stand would be well maintained, blending with the neighborhood's charm. Permit process. Any resident interested in selling homegrown food could apply for a special permit, ensuring fairness. Daniel immediately nodded. This makes sense. It's structured, it's fair, and it benefits the entire community. Linda pursed her lips. I'll need time to review it. Ethan didn't back down. Linda, with all due respect, the community is already reviewing it. Every person in this neighborhood is watching what happens next. She exhaled. Give us a few days. Ethan left the meeting, feeling something he hadn't in weeks. Hope. 2 days later, the HOA called an emergency vote. The decision? a revised bylaw allowing limited farm stands under structured guidelines. It passed overwhelmingly. Ethan's farm stand and the future of local food access had been saved. The next weekend, Ethan stood behind his stand, surrounded by smiling neighbors. Kids picked out fresh peaches, parents exchanged recipes, and the community had never felt stronger. This wasn't just a victory for Ethan, it was a victory for everyone. As Ethan stood behind his newly reopened farm stand, he watched as his neighbors picked out their favorite fruits and vegetables, chatting and laughing like old times. But something had changed. This wasn't just about selling produce anymore. This was about community, resilience, and standing up for what was right. For years, Ethan had seen himself as just a farmer, someone who grew food and shared it with others. But now, he realized he had become something more. A leader, an advocate, a voice for change. The battle with the HOA had transformed him. At first, he had been hesitant, unsure whether fighting back was the right choice. But as he watched his neighbors rally together, he understood something powerful. Change doesn't happen when people stay silent. It happens when they stand up. And stand up, they did. After the revised bylaw passed, something unexpected started happening. Other homeowners, inspired by Ethan's fight, began starting their own small-scale community projects. A retired couple set up a homemade jam stand, using fruits from their backyard trees. A group of neighbors started a community garden, teaching kids how to grow their own food. A local baker, who had always dreamed of sharing his fresh sourdough bread, opened a small weekend stall next to Ethan's. Ethan saw it all and felt a deep sense of pride. His fight hadn't just restored his farm stand, it had ignited a movement. One afternoon, as Ethan stacked baskets of tomatoes, a familiar voice called out, "Linda Hawthorne." The very HOA board member who had fought hardest against him now stood before him, looking different. Not defensive, not stern, almost reflective. She glanced around at the bustling farm stand. "It's really something," she admitted. "I didn't think this would work, but I was wrong." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're saying that out loud?" She smirked. "Don't push your luck." Then, after a moment, she sighed. "Truth is, I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I've never seen people come together like this. You changed things, Ethan." He nodded. "We changed things." She hesitated before finally extending her hand. "No hard feelings?" Ethan shook it firmly. "No hard feelings." That night, Ethan sat on his porch, looking out over his small farm. The fight had been exhausting. There had been moments he wanted to give up. But now, as he watched his neighbors enjoying the fresh food they had fought for, he knew it had been worth every second. Because this wasn't just about his farm stand. It was about empowering an entire community and proving that when people stand together, they can change the world. Ethan never imagined that standing up for his small farm stand would lead to something so much bigger. What started as a battle over a simple rule had turned into a movement, one that had brought his community together in ways he never thought possible. Standing behind his farm stand on a bright Saturday morning, he watched as neighbors filled their baskets with fresh produce. Smiles, laughter, the warmth of connection. This was what they had fought for. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at a basket of strawberries. "Mom, can we get some?" His mother smiled and ruffled his hair. "Of course. These are the best in town." Ethan chuckled. Hearing that never got old. As he handed the boy a pint of strawberries, he glanced up and saw Daniel Reeves, the HOA board member who had first supported him. Daniel walked over, arms crossed, but with a grin on his face. "Well, Carter, you really did it. Ethan smirked. We did it. Daniel nodded. The board's been talking. Turns out the whole ordeal actually made us rethink a lot of things. Maybe it's time we stop treating every rule like it's set in stone. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So what are you saying? Daniel chuckled. I'm saying, maybe change isn't such a bad thing after all. That was when it hit Ethan. This wasn't just about one farm stand or one set of rules. This was about how change happens. Not through silence, not through blind obedience, but through action, through community, through standing up together. The real victory wasn't just in reopening his farm stand. It was in proving that people could come together and fight for something that mattered. As the sun set that evening, Ethan sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. The struggle had been tough, but the outcome, unbelievable. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community. A stronger, more connected, and more empowered community. One that now knew its own strength. Ethan took a deep breath, looking over his farm, his stand, and the people who had made this victory possible, and he smiled. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Ethan's journey taught a powerful lesson. Real change begins when people refuse to accept unfair rules without question. At first, he thought complying with the HOA's demands would bring peace. But in reality, it only exposed how fragile access to fresh, local food could be when left in the hands of bureaucratic policies. By standing up for what he believed in, he didn't just change one rule, he changed an entire community. This story is a reminder that rules should serve people, not the other way around. If something isn't right, if it's harming a community rather than helping it, it's our responsibility to challenge it. Ethan didn't start this fight expecting to become a leader. He was just a farmer who loved what he did. But when he realized that his stand wasn't just about selling vegetables, it was about connection, health, and independence, he knew he couldn't back down. And because of that decision, his neighborhood is stronger than ever. Now think about your own community. Are there outdated rules or unnecessary restrictions affecting your daily life? Maybe a small business struggling due to overregulation, a neighborhood policy that doesn't make sense, or even a lack of access to fresh food. Change starts with awareness and action. Start conversations, talk to your neighbors and local leaders, educate yourself on the rules affecting your community, advocate for change, attend meetings, write letters, start petitions, support local businesses and farmers whenever possible. Ethan's story isn't just about one neighborhood, it's about all of us. If we come together, challenge unfair policies, and demand better solutions, we can build stronger, more connected, and more self-sufficient communities. Because in the end, the power doesn't belong to the rule makers. It belongs to the people willing to stand up and fight for what's right.